My husband is so cheap, he refuses to buy me flowers. So instead, I grow my own and I've started a flower farm. Honestly, I'm not a huge flower person, but last year we bought a farm and growing cut flowers for bouquets was part of our farm plan. So because of that, I planted this 1,000 square foot cutting garden. I've been doing this on a pretty large scale. Every week we're cutting about 50 bouquets out of here to sell at our farmers market, and it wouldn't take much to, even get another 25 out of this space. And that might not be what you want to do. That's a little much. But the one thing that's really surprised me is how easy it's been to grow these cut flowers. Not being a person who had a big flower garden before, I didn't think that I'd have very much success. And if I'm honest, I've made a lot of mistakes with these flowers. But despite that, they're working out super well. I got lots of flowers to pick, and I think that if you follow the simple steps that I did to get a cut flower garden going, you'll find it's really simple too. The first step is to pick the right flowers for growing. Not all flowers are going to be really good for cut flowers. You want something that's going to last a little bit of time in the vase. You also want to make sure that you pick varieties that are going to be tall. Short varieties aren't really going to give you any stem when you go to cut them, whereas varieties that are a meter tall, some varieties 150 centimeters, like 5 feet. If you're getting something that's really tall, you'll get more of a flower stem to work with for making a bouquet. When I picked the varieties that I wanted to grow here, I also took into consideration the climate. We're really hot and dry in the summer, and to make the flowers as easy to grow as possible, I went for drought-tolerant flowers that like the heat. But if you're somewhere that's more temperate, you're gonna want to get stuff that does better in cool weather. When you pick your seeds, think of your climate. You also don't want to grow just one thing. You want to make sure you have a whole range of stuff. When you're thinking of a flower garden, it's usually those big, beautiful focal flowers that really jump out. But when you go to make a bouquet, the little smaller things are almost as important. So you want to make sure you have stuff that's called filler flower. For that, I'm growing different types of basil. I had some baby's breath. I have a few other greens. A common one that I've seen people do is raspberry leaves. And there's also lots of weeds that you can kind of just find wherever that work as a filler too. You also want to have a range of flower sizes. There's things that get categorized as spikes, like a snapdragon that's long and skinny. As well, you want big flowers and small flowers. Having those little pieces makes it so that when you go to make that final bouquet at the end with your cut flowers, you can make something dynamic and fun. And you won't have that if you don't buy it. This is our first year farming, so most of what's filled in my flower garden is annual plants. Those are plants that you plant in the spring, they grow for the summer, and then they die at the end of the season. But I'm also starting to think ahead for years to come with stuff like this. This is liatris and it's a perennial. So this is something that I planted in the garden this year. I can cut it for this year, but then next year it'll come back. And every year it's gonna come back stronger and better. If you get more perennials into your garden, you have stuff that'll come earlier or take less work. So the type of plants that you pick for your cutting garden is also important too. Perennial or annual.
Are you being cute, Bo?
Step 2 is planting the plants now that you have the seeds. I bought seeds for everything in this garden, but not everything was planted just direct seeds into the dirt. Some of these I started ahead of time as little seedlings to get a little head start on the season. The cosmos and the zinnias here behind me are stuff that I started as seedlings and got in the ground. And they were planted in the spring, but they took a long time to get established. So these weren't actually ready until the summer. And that's one thing that you want to consider too, how long it's going to take till your plants flower. because some stuff will be ready earlier than others, and if you want to have your cutting garden be available for you to pick out of for as long as possible, you want to kind of have a succession of flowers coming. The good thing about cosmos and zinnias, though, is once they start, as long as you keep them picked, they'll just keep going and going and going until the frost. So I put a lot of effort into these because I will get a long picking period out of them. This section here had baby's breath, which you can see kind of still doing a little bit of something. This is an area where I messed up a little bit because baby's breath only has a couple week window for when you can pick it for the bouquets. What I should have done, rather than just planting it once and then having it fade out like this, is every 2 weeks I should have put new seeds into the ground so I could have kept picking baby's breath for a long period of time. Stuff like this, it only comes once. It's not like the cosmos and the zinnias where you pick it and it comes back again. And so for this, you got to have some sort of succession plan in mind. Now that you have your garden planted, step 3 is actually growing your plants. The healthier your plants and the better you treat them over the growing season, the bigger and more beautiful and longer you're gonna get the flowers out of it. So growing your flowers the best you possibly can is gonna really help you for your cut flowers in the end. Some of the seedlings that I got into the ground here, I didn't get them planted in time. There was some lapses of them not getting watered consistently, and that caused them to suffer a little bit. You know, at this point, end of August, with it just going crazy, it doesn't necessarily look like it, but my plants had about 2 weeks before they got stems long enough, more than it would have taken for them if I had been kinder and a better grower. So the better you grow your plants, the better your flowers end up. I failed to do it here in my garden, but one thing you want to do when the plants are still fairly small is to stake them or to get some sort of netting for them to grow in. You can see how tall these cosmos are. They're almost as tall as me. They're definitely, a good 5 feet. And down here, you can see the plants, they're falling apart, they're falling over, they're cracking off because there's just so much plant. If I would have had these staked, more contained, it would have made it so they can grow a lot better. The branches would have been straighter. It would have been a lot easier to have it. For this, there's tricks to do it on a large scale, but in a home garden, even, just a little stick in the ground and then a little wrap to tie the plants on would make a big difference. Another thing that's common to do for your flowers is to pinch the top when the plant gets about 12 inches. At that point, you take it and you pinch off a good generous amount, and it leads to the plant branching. But you also need to decide how you want your plants to look. This plant here is a good example of a plant that didn't get pinched, just has one big spike that's coming up, and it's making this really big and impressive cone of flowers. Whereas this plant here, it was pinched, and I have a lot of smaller spikes, so I have more to use, but it's not making the same big impression as this one is. So I'm not going to get as much out of it, but maybe this is the look I'm going for. And with lots of plants, that's how it works. Stuff like the zinnias, though, it's a good idea to pinch them. The flowers are going to be the same no matter what. You also want to make sure that you're keeping your plants weeded. If you don't weed the garden, they'll get overgrown with the weeds and the flowers just won't do anything. For a couple of our beds, we used landscape fabric, and we actually planted the plants into holes that are melted into the fabric. And that makes it super easy. There's pretty much no weeding that needs to get done, other than, the first week or two. There was maybe a few other weeds that were in the holes along with the little seedlings. But we did also have a few other beds, like this basil bed here, that was planted directly into the ground. And for those, we had to weed it, go in and hand weed it probably once every 2 weeks for a couple weeks. The basil, I think I did 3 big big weeds on it before they eventually got big and full enough that they, they outcompeted the weeds at that point. But yeah, there was one bed where the flowers, they got overtaken by the weeds and they didn't do anything. So you want to make sure that you're keeping the weeds under control. Step 4 is picking. So let's get some tools. I got my pruners. I have a pair of small little curved shears. Something like this is really common to find, and I really like them. These are nice and sharp. Having a nice sharp cutter is going to make it so you can get in there, snip off the stem really easy. You don't want to be working with dull tools. And then very complicated tools for cut flowers. You need a big old bucket of water. My mom gives me all of her leftover buckets, so we got a bunch of these hanging around. Different flowers have different times and ways that you're supposed to pick them. Some flowers you're supposed to pick them when the buds are just barely opening so that you get the longest vase life. With most cut flowers, for me, my goal is to get a week in the vase. I want to be able to bring a bouquet down to the market that'll last for the week, but depending on what the flowers are, there's different amounts of times that they last. So I know when I picked my seeds, I picked everything for that length, so I know that I can pick it together and they'll all stay alive for the same amount of time. But it's a good idea if you don't know how long something lasts to do a vase test, which is just putting a plant in water and seeing how long it takes before it dies, or Google for everything. Just vase life, whatever flower. Zinnias are a little bit unique because you actually pick the zinnias when they're fully open. To test if they're ready to be picked, you shake them, and if the flower has a nice strong stem, then it's ready. Whereas if the bud is just kind of opening and the stem hasn't hardened, you want to leave those to get a little bit firmer. This one is, it's ready to go. How I decide where to pick it is I go down to the first branching of a new flower coming in, and then I just snip it off at the top. The zinnias at this point are getting a pretty good stem length for me for where that stem happens. You can choose to pick below that, but it might take a little bit more energy, a little bit more time for that new branching and new flowers to grow. The zinnias, they are cut and come again, so the more of those little branches I leave, the more flowers I'll have to pick later. The snapdragons are a little bit different. If I pick them where, the little leaf bud was, I'd be picking it up here, there'd be nothing to it. And for me, having a stem I can actually use is more important than any, potential flowers I'll get later. So on the snapdragons, I just pick it as low as I possibly can. And all this stuff, even though maybe it would have been something I would want to leave if it was gonna stay in my garden, all of that is just fine because you need something to put in the vase. Another trick that I've found for doing my bouquets, I'm picking probably 8 buckets worth every time I go to do bouquets. I find it a lot easier if I organize my flowers separately. So I keep all my snapdragons together and all my zinnias in a separate bucket, all my basil filler in a separate bucket. Having them all separated, not getting mixed in, just makes it easier for me when I go to grab them and work with them.
That water's for flowers, Patty.
Make sure to have fresh, uncontaminated water. Now that I have everything picked, step 5 is arranging. I am definitely not the place to be getting all the nitty-gritty on this part. You can literally get a university degree in being a florist, and I do not have that level of skill. But there are some basics that are good to know for when you put a bouquet together. When I went to make my very first bouquet, I had all my flowers picked, sat down here, I pulled out my phone, and I literally Googled how to make a bouquet, and a really great floret flower article came up, which just gave me a recipe, and I've basically been running off of that concept ever since. But the idea is you want kind of a bit of everything. You want something that has some height. You want something that has like a focal flower to it. You want, you know, little pieces that, you know, contrast against, you know, maybe a firmer focal flower, and you just kind of play with it. There's lots of details that you can learn about how to properly store everything. There's, you know, dirty flowers, flowers that contaminate the water and make it so the vase life isn't as long. There's, you know, different ways to cut the bottom of the stem to get them to take up water, different things you can put into the water to make everything last longer. But I don't do any of that. We're just doing very basic market bouquets. But there is something that I am very careful to do for keeping my flowers clean and getting a longer vase life. And that is any leaves that are lower down on the stem, I strip those off. You don't want any sort of foliage in the water. So before I go to work with stuff, I usually just strip all the stems so then I know everything. You know, if it's higher up, I'll leave the leaves, but I won't always leave that too because it can start to get too crowded. But yeah, strip your leaves. The technique for stripping the leaves quickly and efficiently on most flowers is you just take your fingers, run it down. They strip off really easily. There are some things, like if I grab some of these sunflowers, they start to get too heavy. If I tried to strip this, it doesn't really want to pull off. For those, I will just snip them. Takes a bit longer, but I don't want to be breaking my stem when I go to take the leaves off, because then I'll be completely wasting my time because the stem won't be good anymore.
Instead of only half wasting your time because you only sell half the bouquets. What do you do about cats in your bouquets?
You always want to make sure to have a healthy amount of cat. You probably want about 10% cat in your market bouquets, because they really bring the cuteness level up.
Oh, they do.
Right? You gotta put some cute in there by putting some cat in. Okay, let's put one of these bouquets together. I like to start with a big kind of center feature piece. So I've been really liking these amaranths. People have told me that I make very interesting bouquets, partially because I probably don't know what I'm doing, but people seem to like it. I've been doing a lot of these very vertical shapes because I have so much of this amaranth and I love working with it. So I start with something like this, and then I grab some filler. The main filler that I've been using is this basil, and if I have a nice long piece of amaranth, I want to try to find some longer pieces of basil, because the height of your bouquet is going to be based on the shortest stem. You can't, I can't have pieces up here when the stem is all the way down here, because once it gets in the water, these aren't in the water, they're all going to die. Oh, I got bees in my sleeping in my plants. So I'm not going to grab those ones. I'm going to go through this bucket, find a couple longer pieces, and like I said, I strip the bottom stuff off, and then I just kind of put some stuff around this center focus, fill it in. You can like have a theme for your bouquet. You can go for a specific color palette. For this one, I'm gonna do kind of like a multi-color is my plan. But if I wanted to go for kind of like a darker color palette, I could have stuck with this dark amaranth and then gone with like a darker filler. But I'm gonna do a whole mix of things in this one, so I think the green's gonna look good for it. So I just want a little bit of filler in there. This is just gonna kind of, you know, be my basis for building around. And I also am running out of this. I only have a few weeks of it left in the garden, so I don't want to use all of it and then not have any more for the next couple markets. And then from here, I usually start to put in some of the bigger flowers next. I like to, you know, put something like this. This is something that would be considered like a spike. It's, you know, this very straight and upright. It has a different shape than like a spiky shape. It's fun to have some of those in there. I'm kind of grabbing these based on like the idea. Like I'm still keeping my attention on the stem length. So I like the look of those, kind of balancing it out. And then let's go for some dramatic orange, big focal flowers. So that this would be considered a focal flower because it's big, it's punchy. When you look at the bouquet, it's going to be one of the first things that grabs your attention. And then because I want this one to be multicolored, I'm going to grab a few more of these zinnias in bright, dramatic colors. Go for the multicolor. Here's like a yellow. What else do we got? And then we'll do a red one in there. They're all different colors, all gonna contrast nicely against each other. And then from here, this is the basis of the bouquet. This is like, you know, what it's basically gonna be. And then I just fill it in a little bit with some of my smaller flowers. These have shorter stem length. So at this point, I'm gonna put them on the outside because they're a little bit lower. So I can get them to kind of nestle in under. And then, but I still need to, I'm gonna try to make this on a tall one. So I'm still kind of looking for something that isn't too bad. I don't want super shorties on this. Grab some of these ones too. All right, so I put in this kind of second layer of smaller flowers, and I'm now happy with that. That's what I think is a $10 bouquet. You know, I could keep adding on, keep filling it, making it bigger, but gotta pay more money for that. This is what you get for 10 bucks. So then at this point, I find the shortest stem in here. There's one right here. And I trim everything to that length. And then, because I am selling these out of buckets, I take an elastic and I elastic it together so that it doesn't fall apart. And then into a bucket of fresh water till market. Step 6, enjoy.